Welcome to Theology for the People. My name is Nick Cady. I'm your host. And the purpose of this podcast is to bring theological topics and discussions to you in a way that is engaging and understandable. For many Christians in the West, persecution might mean awkward conversations or social pushback. But in many parts of the world, following Jesus can mean losing your family and your livelihood or even your life. And in this episode of Theology for the People, I'm joined by a man named Matt. He's a missionary who has spent the past 15 years planting churches in North Africa. We discuss the realities of persecution, the challenges that are faced by new believers in Muslim-majority contexts, and why missionaries need a biblical theology of suffering when it comes to proclaiming the gospel. Matt recently wrote a book called Persecution and Missions, A Practical Theology. And in this conversation, he helps us understand why persecution isn't just an occasional challenge for missions. It's often built into the structure of societies where the gospel is most needed because it's most lacking. You'll notice that this episode is audio only. That's because Matt asked that we protect his identity for the sake of those to whom he and his family are ministering, so they don't face unnecessary backlash from being associated with him. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. I'll be back at the end with a few closing words. Matt, thanks for being a guest on Theology for the People.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So Matt, just for my sake, and we're meeting for the first time, but also for our listeners, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. What's been your journey in life and ministry up until this point?
Yeah, I've been working in North Africa for about 15 years now as a church planter, first in one country and then had to leave a couple of years later. And so the country my wife and I are working in now, I've been there for almost 15 years. And yeah, it's been a slow work. We're working in a tribal language that's spoken by about somewhere over 1 million people. But the folks that speak it, they speak Arabic extensively as well. And it's kind of anyone's guess when you meet someone if they're stronger in Arabic or in the tribal language. So a lot of that work was just getting to learn the languages. And yeah, besides that, the Lord's given us 3 wonderful children. And so we're really enjoying this phase of life.
Yeah, and so tell us a bit, how'd you end up in North Africa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at the time I was looking for places I didn't feel people had been working before. There's a lot of things I can't handle well. You know, my brother teaches remedial math to high school students. I couldn't do that, but I've always been able to handle rougher living a little better. And then a huge part of it was finding teams I felt I could work well with, because when you are overseas trying to do church planting, there's just so many different approaches, and you really need to make sure that you're seeing eye to eye with the people you're working with.
So you wrote this book, it just came out. It's called Persecution and Missions, A Practical Theology. What was it that compelled you to write a book on persecution specifically when it came to missions?
Well, when I had left the States, I had expected to do a lot of talking to people about the relative merits of Christianity and Islam. And we do that. But the longer I've been on the field, the more I've been realizing that often people aren't even able to engage with those discussions because they're so worried about the things that they're going to have to lose if they follow Christ, or in some cases are even seen to be investigating Christ. And so as I started looking through the New Testament to see what it says about this, I think I started developing a conviction that this is really, it's a structural problem in missions, and people aren't held in darkness just because they haven't heard the truth or because they've been convinced by other things, but also because there's a real threat. And this is true throughout most of the unreached world.
So the area where you're working is primarily Muslim?
Yeah, the folks that we're working with, I would say the tribe is roughly 100% Muslim. There are now a handful of Christian believers or people who would profess Christ in some sense or another and in certain contexts. And a very small subset of those would openly profess Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, what is the reception to Christianity? I mean, and also, like, what's their level of commitment to Islam? I know that that's something that varies a lot over the Muslim world. So, yeah, tell us some stories perhaps of, what the reception has been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think On an abstract level, people are very happy with everyone should choose their own religion. What happens is that when somebody actually does begin engaging with Christ, it's a huge shame for their family. And we have seen people who they became believers and their wife and children were taken away by the in-laws. We have seen people threatened. We know people who have been beaten. So we haven't seen any sort of lethal violence used against people. Among our tribe and surrounding tribes, we have seen that sort of thing. There was a guy who was, by God's grace, he didn't die, but was left for dead. So anyway, all that to say, there's intense social pressure, and what is sort of surprising about it in a way is that yeah, people are often very nominal Muslims. We know lots
Hmm.
of people who openly drink, who aren't very interested in keeping the five pillars of Islam, but to to leave the fold of Islam is a very different thing.
Yeah. So myself and my wife is originally from San Diego, but we spent a long time in Hungary as missionaries, and we were there right after 9/11
Right.
was when I moved there. And so we worked in a refugee camp that was run by the UNHCR.
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time with Muslims, and we actually saw a lot of Muslim converts. One of the things that really helped Muslims convert to Christianity in our experience was just the fact that they were in a different context where there wasn't as much of that social pressure. But then even within the camp itself, of course, there was pressure. And we did see people. We saw one guy similarly to what you're saying. We had one convert from Iran, who, he got a little bit. I think he's a little bit too loose-lipped about his opinions and things like that, and kind of pushing the issue with his new faith in Christianity. And he was left for dead. Thankfully, he didn't die, and we're still in touch with him today. But he actually, we heard other stories of people. Most of our people we were working with were from Iran, Bangladesh. We had some from Iraq and a few other places, but we would hear all these stories of people who lost their connection with their family. Their family would never speak to them ever again. And it was a really, heavy thing to navigate. I think that for many people outside of that context, we think of persecution in terms of like maybe people will, make snide comments about you at school, or, you know, baptism is something that you can do with little pushback. It's generally like thought of as a positive thing in the United States, even if somebody doesn't
Right.
believe what you believe. But yeah, to be baptized for people coming out of a Muslim background, it was like, yeah, I mean, this is a huge break with your entire
Right.
society. You can maybe never return home. Your parents might disown you. So, yeah, and I've tried to share that with people over here, and I think it's an important perspective for them to have. And I assume that's part of what you're hoping with this book to accomplish, is it not?
Yeah, it is, and I think as well, I want to give people sort of a more realistic view of persecution, something that we often hear both back at home and honestly from other missionaries is that persecution is good for the church. The reason the Western church is so stagnant is there's not enough persecution. God works through persecution. So I don't want to say that it's a loss, but God works through war, He works through cancer, He works through divorce. So nothing is ultimately a loss in God's plan. Nevertheless, persecution really does take a toll on the church. And one of the things that is critical in helping people through it is acknowledging that and trying to help them figure out, is it best for me to endure this especially at times when the persecution gets really bad. Jesus says, if they persecute you in one city, flee to the next. So at what point do we start invoking that, even if that means that maybe somebody's evangelistic ministry that we hope for is going to get cut a little bit short? And then how do we bring them back from that afterwards when things cool off a little?
Yeah. Yeah, so the persecution that you experience and write about in the book, is it primarily in regard to missionaries who are going into a new context, like a foreign context, or is it more about the persecution that believers themselves suffer in those areas?
I think the second is probably my primary concern because I think that is where the expansion of the church gets stopped. Where, in a sense, the New Testament repeatedly paints persecution as something that originates from the devil himself. Now, that doesn't mean every unkind word that people say, he's inciting it, personally and consciously, but there certainly are times when he does.
Hmm.
And even when he doesn't, the systems of deception that he has laid are behind these things. And anyway, that in Hebrews 2, it says that he uses the fear of death to keep people in lifelong slavery. And so that's, I think, what we're seeing is, as missionaries, we need a way to help people through the fear of death. And we need to give them a real solid hope of resurrection and reward.
And when it comes to persecution, do you and your family and you and your team, do you suffer any form of persecution, or is it more the people that you're working with?
We'll never suffer in the ways that they have. Well, never say never. We haven't suffered in the ways that they have. The first country I worked in, I was forced out during sort of I guess, a purge of people who were doing missionary work there. But even that, as an American citizen with a powerful and a pushy government, it was about as comfortable as it could have been. And so I think there is a sense where I'm not likely to suffer the same things that people will. Nevertheless, I guess it's a little bit like a doctor who hasn't had cancer. You still have to help people through these things.
Hmm. Yeah. So could you give us kind of an overview of what you cover in the book?
Yeah. I start by trying to show in the New Testament that persecution is a structural problem in missions, that where there are no believers, almost by definition, there will be systems of persecution because this is how unbelief works. It wants to hold people in. And so, for example, in Revelation 2, Jesus doesn't say that Rome has imprisoned some of you. He says Satan has. And it's an intimidation thing. I remember two of my friends talking, and one of them said he wanted to read the New Testament, and the other said, well, you can't do that. They take your wife and kids away. And so he hasn't even started to evaluate the claims of Jesus, and there's already terror. And then I want to go on from there and talk about why is it that God takes us through this, and what is it that's waiting beyond it to get us through. 'Cause I think the joy and the reward that Jesus offers is really the more important side of the coin. And then the last couple chapters, I'm talking about, okay, as missionaries, when we see people being persecuted or when we're experiencing suffering, stress, persecution, how do we get through those things so that our faith isn't damaged?
I noticed you have a chapter on discipling persecuted believers in churches. Or do you think there are any mistakes that Western missionaries make when discipling believers in these contexts?
Yeah, I'd say there's primarily two mistakes. The one is that we we offer a lot of honor to persecuted people, and that's great, but we tends to be very allergic to extraction. So you talked about, people who you knew who lost their communities, and extraction in the New Testament is a part of persecution. You can't tease the two apart. So I think what missionaries often do is we try to find ways for people to stay in their communities when you can't really do that as a Christian. Rather than allowing what Jesus does, you can get out. You can flee to the next city and you can wait until things cool down. And so I think that just puts a lot of pressure on people. We've seen in the U.S. women who are being beaten by their husbands, and instead of first getting her to a safe house, the pastor says, "Go back there and share the gospel with them." And we sort of understand in our context the cruelty that could have, but in missions, it just seems bold. I think the second mistake we make sort of flows from that is then we start trying to find ways that they can live with communities that are very angry with the gospel. And so there's a lot of compromises that end up getting made. Maybe it's okay for you to pray with your Muslim neighbors 5 times a day and just say different words in your heart. And as we're doing that, what we're doing is we're slowly actually whittling away at their witness, which, they should be able to stand boldly. And so what I really want to see people doing is from the start of evangelism saying, this is not an easy message. It's a worthwhile message. And if you understand it, you will give up everything for it. but don't come here if you want an easy message.
Yeah, one of the things that I dealt with a lot in Hungary, but also I know that when we worked with Muslims, it was always a big question. There's a couple different approaches that people take to how much do you try to find those commonalities between Islam and Christianity, between the Quran and the Bible, and use those as bridges to reach people with the gospel, or how much do you say, you know what, let's just not have anything to do with that because we might say it's the doctrine of demons even. And so where do you fall with that? I mean, where do you fall on that kind of spectrum when it comes to epistemology and those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really important one. I do want to embrace the commonalities that we have. I just don't want that to be my emphasis. So, because I see Jesus even on the Sermon on the Mount, he starts by saying, "Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And so, he's definitely pulling from all the same religious texts. He's embracing the commonality that there is, but the overall message is that the differences here between how you've been taught to practice and what God wants are more significant. And I don't I don't enjoy telling that to people. I think it makes people feel put off. But ultimately, if we have nothing to offer them that is not very different than what they already believe, they'll just find ways to take what they like and incorporate it into their worldview.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, this is a historical, discussion, I guess I would say, not an argument, but it goes, yeah, I think you could trace it all the way back to like Justin Martyr, writing about how Jesus is the true philosophy. He's coming from a philosophical background. He's saying that the gospel is the true philosophy. It's the thing which Plato and these other people had sensed, but they hadn't had the true light of revelation given to them. So they were right about the things that they sensed, and like they got as far as they could without direct revelation from God. And so therefore, what we need to do is help them fill it out. So you have those kind of people. And then you have like Tertullian on the other side who says, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Right?
Right.
Meaning like, why should we care what Greek philosophy says or thinks? Because we have everything we need for life and godliness in the Bible.
Yeah.
And then that same thing has been carried into missions. So you've got like Patrick of Ireland, who meets the people with the Druids with a power encounter, which is the language that they speak, so to say. You have other examples of like in other places where they would take the pagan temples and turn them into churches. That's like Patrick's model. And then you have
Mhm.
like Boniface in Germany, who's like, you guys worship this sacred oak tree, and I'm going to cut it down while you watch me cut it down. You know what I mean? And show you that
Right, right.
I'm going to take this down right in front of your eyes. And he tore down
Mhm.
all the pagan temples to their foundations and said, we'll never touch these ever again. And I think it's an interesting thing because, I remember when we were working with a lot of Muslim people, there was this question of like, okay, the Quran says things about Jesus. In
Mhm.
many ways, they're trying to like contradict what the Bible says about Jesus and give a different take on it. But we would say, hey, look, your book says that you should honor the people of the book, and your book says that Jesus is a great prophet. And if Jesus is a great prophet, well, then here's what he said. But we always would, of course, run into the thing where they would say, well, our scriptures are correct and yours have been changed. And
Right.
so, yeah, how do you guys approach these sorts of things?
Yeah, I think we do we don't ultimately feel in our context that it's helpful to talk too much about the Quran, mostly just because the folks that we're working with, when they're talking about the Quran, they usually feel like they need to be pushing that part of the discussion on you. So we kind of want to change the subject to things where we feel they're a little more open. I don't mind talking from the Quran, but I guess to me, I love what Paul does in Acts 17. He's as gracious as he can be. I see that you are very religious. Nevertheless, he ends his sermon, turn from these vain things. And so I think it's okay to affirm parts of truth that we see as long as we don't pull punches with, but that's not enough. Hey, it's great in Islam that people have stopped worshiping idols, that they don't worship spirits. There's parts of Muslim morality that we think are Christian, but this is not nearly enough. And the differences with Christianity are still more significant. And I think even though that will shut down some discussions, it actually ends up drawing people in more who really want to know. Because
Hmm.
especially where we are, there's been a lot of tribal violence in the name of Islam that's happened, and people they're looking for something else. And so we don't want this to just be, this is just a slightly better flavor of what you have. We want to know this is night and day. Sure, there's elements of
Hmm.
truth in that, but the truth is missing.
Hmm. Yeah. Just this past year, I was in Novi Pazar in Serbia. So I was visiting some friends in Serbia, and they're planting a church, and they've got a few other church plants going on. But there's a group from the city Novi Pazar, which is really the capital of what's called the Sanjak region. Sanjak is the Muslim region of Serbia. So the people who live there call themselves Bosniaks, and so it's
Okay.
like 80 to 90% Muslim in this city. And, we have some missionary friends who live there, and I think they feel that the hardest part of their missionary work is like, how do you even make contact with people? How do you break into society? How do you get friends and then like introduce them to like the whole reason I came to your community was to, well, convert and disciple followers of Jesus. And so, they've used different methods, through sports and through after school programs. I'm just curious, how does that work for you guys? I mean, just showing up in a community, how do you
Yeah.
start to make those inroads in relationships through which you have gospel conversations?
I think where we are, we've really been blessed in a few different ways. One is that even the area of our country that we're in is 100% Muslim, essentially, but the country itself has a large Christian subpopulation. So we are able to be there on what's called a religious visa. So we don't have to do anything else to get in. We tell people we are here with the church. And there's been a history of missionaries in our community who, even though their message was not embraced, they made contributions that were really appreciated. So there was a doctor there maybe 15 years ago during a cholera epidemic who saved, dozens of lives. And so I think people generally have been mostly accepting of this is just the weird thing we do. Everyone has a weird thing. We also are living in a village, and so it's not really possible for neighbors to not engage with us. It's just a very sort of old-fashioned, extremely social society. There was a guy who died, and his neighbors didn't find him for 3 days, and the government locked them up, imprisoned
Mm.
them because they should have greeted him and known that. And when he didn't greet back, they should have known he was dead. So I think that's been something that we've had. That's just been something that has been easier for us due to some gracious gifts the Lord has given us.
Yeah, I know that even when I was in Hungary, church planting, it was a funny thing when I would meet people and they say, "Why are you here?" And I'd say, "Well, I came here to plant a church." And eventually they kind of put two and two together. They're like, "Oh, so you came to convert me," right? And I'm like,
Mhm.
and it would be like, "Yeah." So
Mm.
I mean, do people put those two together with you guys that you are Christians and you are hoping to see them become Christians as well?
Yeah, they do. And I mean, I think mostly people, well, I think there is a lot of concern that maybe we're paying people to become Christians, which is just such a bad idea. I, I've actually seen it done in various forms, and it's never worked
Wow.
well. And so I think we kind of say, hey, we would love for people to become believers, but that has to be something they do on their own steam because they want to. You know, one thing I love about working in the Muslim world is that people are always trying to convert me. So I think there's a sense where like these are important things. Of course, we're going to engage about them. Whereas I know when I'm back in the U.S., if I'm with unbelieving friends, if you drop the J word, the whole room can go silent. So
Mm.
I think there is a sense where it's a little more natural to them. That doesn't give them an easy way to leave their own communities or their communities' religious beliefs. But yeah, I think they are sort of they almost expect it.
Mhm. Okay. Well, I noticed that I think it's your final chapter is on poverty, wealth, and missionary calling. Could you just talk to me about that for a little bit? Where does that come into your experience and what you are writing about in this book?
Yeah, we work in an impoverished area, and we people in our area, they know that there are wealthy Christians, and unfortunately, we've had a lot of Christian groups come through and pay people an awful lot of money to do things and then scoot out of town. And so I think this is, it's not so much dependency that we're worried about as double mindedness. People feel that if they become Christian, then they should be richer than they were before. And, or that if they become Christian, missionaries ought to be helping them out financially in pretty significant ways. And as a missionary community, that is a lot of what we do. We go into places with big nonprofit organizations, or we go in and start businesses, and we start hiring people, and we pray that those people will become Christians. But I think we often don't understand what a conflicted set of decisions they face, sometimes in ways they don't even fully understand. And so I'm really wanting to warn people about this.
I saw that you also have a chapter on the new Exodus and the Promised Land, and I mean, I know what that means in the terms of, like, how that regards salvation in general, but how does it apply to what you're writing about in this book?
So I think both with financial difficulties and especially with persecution, this is the lens that the New Testament takes. Hebrews is written to these persecuted believers, and one of the things he tells them is in chapters 3 and 4, he says, "Don't do what your fathers did. They became afraid in the wilderness. They said, 'You've let us out here to die,' and they wanted to turn back." And so what he's trying to tell them in Hebrews is, no, there is a promised land. Keep on going. And in chapters 11 and 12, it builds to this crescendo where he talks about how, Jesus, he had so much faith in this reward set before him that he's willing to die. And then he turns and says, "Now, none of you yet have suffered to the shedding of your blood." But that's what he wants them to be ready to do, is to see the suffering of this life in a way as this is just the way out of Egypt. Of course, the ruler of Egypt is trying to keep us here.
Yeah. What is the biggest takeaway you hope that people will come away with from reading your book?
I hope that people will be proactive in talking to people about persecution and presenting the gospel in such a way that if you don't really believe in an eternal reward and eternal life, you're not going to accept it, or you're not going to portray yourself as having done that. I think often, and I'm sure you'll relate to this having worked with Muslims in Hungary, it's so hard to get people interested that when you do, you'll kind of do anything for them not to take a step backwards. And so
Yeah.
I feel that all the time, right? And so, but that ends up creating a lot of people who are really unready to engage with the claims of Christ. But you're so accommodating and you're trying so hard to move them forward instead of just saying, you know what, like Jesus does, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but you might be homeless if you follow me. So don't come if you're not ready for that. And I think we end up encouraging a lot of people sometimes over the line before they're ready.
How much do you think that people in your context conflate Christianity with like Western values and like being Western in general? Because
Mhm.
I know that that was historically also an issue in the history of missions, right? Especially in Asia, when it came to proclaiming the gospel and people saying, "Well, in order to do that, right, you're essentially asking me to abandon my culture and
Right.
become Western." And
Yeah.
so what's your experience with that where you're at?
I think people do tend to assume that, but usually those are assumptions they haven't thought through a lot. I don't think that's usually that usually hasn't been a huge stumbling block for people. I think once people are interested in Christ, then there's kind of a question of, yeah, then it does become difficult. What parts of my culture can I keep? My culture as an American is very materialistic, and is just shot through with sin in lots of ways, as well as having a lot of beautiful things. And so they're sorting through those same things in their own cultures, and it is pretty rough. But I think usually people kind of are able pretty quickly, if you say, well, you don't agree with everything your government does and everything that happens in your society, I'm the same. Usually people can accept that.
Yeah, yeah, and it does sound like it probably helps that there are some people in the country who are Christians in
Yeah,
that context. So, yeah.
yeah.
So, how are the main ways? Like, if people are listening to this and they want to pray for you guys, what are your top prayer requests?
There's a handful of people who have professed faith. Pray for them to have the courage to really stand up. I think we just see so many people who get to that point and then shut down. Pray for the sort of international politics in our country. We've had a lot of missionaries who have had to leave due to problems that are kind of way above our heads politically.
Mm.
And you could just pray for safety and blessing for the believers who are there, the folks that we're working with. Many of them are refugees. They've come across from the border from a really terrible war, and they don't really know what's next for them. But man, they are really hurting.
Hmm. Well, thanks, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit about your ministry and about things that people can be praying for. And if people are interested in getting your book, once again, it's called Persecution and Missions. It's part of the 9 Marks series, and it's put out by them. And yeah, the subtitle is A Practical Theology. So thanks again, and we'll be praying for you and your ministry.
Thanks so much for having me on, Nick.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Theology for the People. I'd love it if you would like and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. And if you could give us a follow and a review on a podcasting platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, that really helps boost the show in their algorithms and helps other people discover this content when they're looking for edifying Christian theology content. Thanks for listening once again, and God bless you.